Well, all right, everybody. Welcome to a Friday afternoon edition of the Green Rush Live. I'm Jimmy Young from Pro Cannabis Media.
And I'm David Rabinovitz.
Yes, he is. And David is with us as well. And we're so happy to be joined by a gentleman that I got to talk to briefly about a week ago. And I was so intrigued with his multi-talents. I said, you would be a great interview for the top of our Green Rush International show. His name is Brian Sekandi. Is it Sekandi, Brian?
Brian Sekandi, you got it.
Sekandi like candy cane. I get it. Okay. Brian, tell us a little bit about your story, Brian, because I found it so intriguing. I'd like to, again, enlighten our audience a little bit about how you became to be where you are and in the business that you are in. And then we'll get into the book that you wrote, which I think is awesome.
Fantastic. I really appreciate that intro. So my journey, I guess, to where I'm at today, I've spent the last 17 years in executive recruitment. So helping large global brands, hire and staff individuals across sales, marketing, supply chains, and operations. 2018, as cannabis was becoming federal legalized or regulated here in the Canadian marketplace, I started Pierce Cannabis with a really simple mission. How can we help get more access to cannabis opportunities for more people, especially more diverse people from different backgrounds? As we started that mission, we recognized that we needed to organize the cannabis industry, all of this raw data, this job data, and create a cannabis taxonomy, which we did. It's about 192 subcategories in that taxonomy and 14 primary categories. So if you've read the book, Jimmy, in the back of the book, the glossary, those 14 categories are essentially our primary structure of our cannabis taxonomy. So that's our journey. My personal journey. I'm originally from Uganda. I was born in Uganda, grew up in Zimbabwe, immigrated to Canada when I was fairly young. Grew up in London, Ontario. I first encountered cannabis myself when I was 13 years old at the Royal Army Canadian Cadets, and that was kind of my first kind of exploration into cannabis. At this time, it was wild hemp growing on the Army base, and which we discovered, but that was really kind of the start of the journey of what I would say 20 plus years of cannabis culture experience.
There you go. And that's a great story. And the reason why I wanted Brian to tell his story is because on our Green Rush program now, we are asking people that might be watching this, listening to it, to go onto our website at procannabismedia.com and tell your cannabis story. Come out of the cannabis closet and tell your story. And we've had quite a few entries into this because we are going to pick 5 finalists and then give one lucky winner a your story unit. And of course, because I'm remote, I'm not in my studio, I usually have it on display, but it is a child-proof and smell-proof container for the cannabis connoisseur. It really is a very nice thing. And yourstory.com, story with an I.com, is where you can find out all about that. And by coincidence, it happens to be a Canadian company. Now, I will say this, on past shows, I've actually read a few of these stories, and we've had some amazing stories sent to us. Wow. So that bar to win that storage device is very high right now. And I will say the person who actually entered a video is probably going to be one of the first people to get a t-shirt. I promised whoever entered the contest via video, I would send a t-shirt to her, and I will be sending one to her without giving away her name. But we've had some incredible stories. And Brian, through your journey, David, you work in the cannabis space as well, talking to a lot of entrepreneurs in the social equity space. The various stories that people have about this plant. And let me tell you, when I say various, changed my life, saved my life. I got busted for this. I needed this after my operation. Whatever it is, it's
wouldn't
so
get off
compelling.
Opioids, right?
Right.
And I had those stories. I got to travel a lot. As I was growing up, and especially 16 plus. I studied in England. I traveled, lived in China, lived in Africa, and so in cannabis has always been a place where I could find community, safe space. I could congregate and meet like-minded folks around the world, and especially in environments where, it was definitely a lot more restrictive. So, cannabis for me has always been that side of sidekick, if you would, especially in terms of traveling and meeting new people around the world.
Did you ever have any issues with law enforcement along the way? I had to ask.
So, I've been fortunate that I've never had any major issues in terms of law enforcement. Again, I was very lucky in being able to find safe spaces. And that's what one of the things that is missing in today's cannabis culture is that community. In the legacy cannabis environment, there was a sense of community, and you needed community in order to be safe. There's a lot of pioneers, predating legalization, that built these communities where people would come, artists, entertainers, creators, and they would congregate, they would create, whether it's music or art, expressions, and a lot of that artistic expression really came from, either being inspired by cannabis or being in an environment where cannabis was freely able to be consumed. And so in a lot of my travels, it was really important that I found, like-minded individuals, and very much places that I could find that would safe, especially as a young Black man.
Well, that is cool. And what's funny is I really believe that this plant is designed and was put on this earth to bring people together. And especially during the era, Brian, when it was, you had to sneak around the block and do it, or down the alleyway, or right. And then you'd find someone would smell it and they'd find you, and it'd be a total stranger. And they'd be like, "Hey, how you doing? Hey, good. Get out. Oh yeah, here you go." It was a great way to socialize with people. And I discovered that in the early 70s, let's just say. You mentioned 13. Mine was 14 in 1971. It happens to coincide with the beginning of the Waldos and the 420 movement and all that. And we'll explain that in a little while. But I think now is a great time to talk a little bit about the book that you wrote. Sure. And the name of the book is called Kids of Cannabis. My Mom and Dad Work in Cannabis. And look, There it is being held up, but we're going to do one better for you. I believe we're going to actually superimpose it over to your shoulder, because we have the magical way to do that. And anyway, that being said, why did you write this book is the first thing.
Great. So, since our mission was to expand access to cannabis jobs, we spent 2 years talking to individuals in the industry and those looking to get in the industry. And stigma was still a huge hurdle. In stigma, there's many different facets to stigma. And, and one of the stigmas that we identified that was, nobody was really addressing, or there was no tools to address, was the family stigma. I personally have dealt with that stigma within a family. I know it's not helpful. It can be really traumatic in terms of kind of, your self-identity. And so we really wanted to address a type of stigma that, that could only be addressed, in our opinion, by doing something creative, lighthearted, but really, confronting people's stigma and that idea of, are you going to have a conversation with your kids about cannabis? And if you do, how are you going to approach that conversation? So we knew that was a big issue, and that's one of the kind of the big inspirations of us kind of, writing the book, talking about, parents that work in the industry and how those parents would have that conversation with their kids, but also with their parents as well.
Right. And it's not easy. David, I know for a fact that you too have an interesting story about that as well. And it's never easy. And I'll be perfectly honest with everybody, as I always am on this show, sometimes painfully honest. I'm not quite sure if my parents were alive that I'd still be doing a talk show about cannabis, because I know it would have bothered them. But I also know that my dad was smart enough to know that I was partaking, let's just say. Yeah. Okay. David, what kind of interesting conversations have you had in your family about
cannabis? In my family? Well, my family, that's a curveball question.
Yes, it is.
So
I knew exactly what I was doing.
Yes, you did. So I'll tell you the most interesting story. Okay. Most interesting story is I was at my alma mater, Babson College, and I was going to judge a business plan competition. One of my classmates had created a product for kids who are on the autism spectrum for the classroom. So because he happened to be competing, I was not going to judge the MBA business part of it. I would judge the undergrad. And one of the people who was leading on the judges was one of the professors there. So we start out, everybody goes around the room and introduces themselves. And I start out and I say, what I do would put you to sleep. I'm a consultant to engineering firms in matters of ownership transition, financial issues, M&A support. There you go, Jimmy. That's exactly it. And I said, and on the other end of the barbell, I do consulting in the cannabis sector. Invariably, people light up about that. I remember probably about 6 or 7 years ago being with a team of engineers in Ohio, and we're working on strategic planning. And I happen to mention that I do some stuff in the cannabis sector. Break time comes, and 3 or 4 people come up to me. I said, okay, they're going to start to ask me about how do you become a shareholder in a firm and all that. Brian, not one question about it. Everybody wants to talk to me about cannabis, about marijuana, right?
Yeah.
So we finish up the competition, and the professor reaches out to me, wants to meet with me to talk about marijuana. Well, she's now my fiance, so let me jump to that point. That's why it's an important story in my life.
That is a good story. I really like it.
But there's an important social justice component of this, which is her interest in marijuana wasn't because she was a pothead. It was her son, who was I consider him my stepson now, though he keeps reminding me, you haven't yet married my mother. But
that sounds like Ben.
It is Ben, and Jimmy knows Ben well because in Jimmy's prior business, he trained Ben in the broadcasting area.
Hey, Brian, I got Ben an interview with Bobby Orr, so I'm guessing I'm in his book of life because he was a hockey player. Okay.
Yeah, Ben is you can hear the screams with the playoffs going on. Right. I mean, it's why even doesn't matter what Beth does to put stuff in her ears and over her eyes. Somebody scores or somebody does something stupid, Ben's screaming through the house. Anyway, so Ben's a hockey player. He's playing up in Wisconsin, and for his birthday, his mother sends him, and they're both into Breaking Bad. So his mother sends him some candy she got on Etsy that looks like whatever it is the guy in Breaking Bad cooked up in his lab, that blue crystal meth or whatever. Yeah. It's candy, right?
Okay. Yeah.
It's candy, but it's got the label on it of the label from the Breaking Bad, the Pollo, whatever it is, right. So if you don't watch Breaking Bad, folks, or you didn't, I'm sorry, because this won't make a lot of sense. Somehow there is an issue. The police show up, they find the candy in the room, and they accuse him of having meth. Wow. And he's saying, are you out of your mind? Now he's a freshman. Are you out of your mind? It's candy. My mother sent it to me. They say, no, we had it lab tested, right? Because they're allowed, and they're putting the pressure on him. Yeah. And somehow, as they're putting the pressure on him, they get him to admit that he shared a joint with somebody. Now they arrest him and his roommate, and they're charging, and they're going after him for like distribution because they shared a joint, right? That's how ridiculous it is. Now,
crazy.
Now, and this may not be politically correct the way I'm going to describe it, but I tend to be a very straight shooter. So Ben is a middle-class white kid from an educated family with a very, very intelligent mother. His roommate, I believe I didn't know him, and I didn't know Beth at the time, but I think he was, let's say, Latinx, and his parents were immigrants. So they didn't have a clue what to do with the kid being in trouble. So Beth kind of jumped in, called the other parents and steered it. They withdrew the kids from school. The whole thing just blew up. And the school's attitude was not very helpful. Ben burned all of his hockey gear that said Wisconsin on it, or laid it out and let the dogs defecate all over it. But that's what really got us to get into the social equity scene, because of when she saw up front what can happen and the way people can get railroaded. And if she hadn't had the resources and the intelligence, right, and the experience to know what to do and call an attorney, those two kids' lives, their college lives would have been trashed. And the other kid, if Beth hadn't said to the parents, pull him out of school, and fought for the other kid as well, he would have been just litter on the roadside here with this stuff. So that really drove a lot of our direction. That's how we that's why we pursued the social equity training program with the Mass Cannabis Control Commission. And that's why I do as much mentoring as I can with people who are trying to get into the business.
That's really good.
That's my story.
That's a story. And by the way, that's the first time I've actually heard all the details to that story. I knew the high end, if you will, the highlights, the cliff notes. Back to cliff notes and back to your book. I want to know who illustrated it for you too. Tell us a little bit about that person.
So the illustrator, she's out of Europe. She's currently in a country that doesn't allow cannabis usage, and so she's asked me not to use her last name, but a great artist out of Eastern Europe, and I found her online, and she was interested in the subject matter, which again, there's a lot of stigma around cannabis, and when approaching somebody and saying, and I couldn't share the book details at the time, but I need you to illustrate this children's book around cannabis. It took some time finding the right artist and finding an artist that could give this justice. So I'm really fortunate that we found her and that she was really open to the subject matter, and really helping to create and design the three characters, Jack, Charlotte, and Bruce.
And it's so interesting to me, and you and I had this talk when I am one who believes that parents have a great opportunity now to get themselves educated about cannabis and then incorporate that into the talk about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which every parent has to have with their child at some point. Yeah. So I think that in a lot of ways, this book could serve as a guide for some of those things because of how you spun each issue. Was that the point?
Yeah, well, it's the idea of, and I think about being a kid myself, like I didn't have those tough conversations with my parents early on. You typically have them, when it's too late or you're at that point where, your parents are being forced to have that conversation. And so, cannabis is part of that, I think, arsenal or toolkit of tough conversations that parents will eventually need to have with their kids. And, as I said to you, when we first connected, and I'm saying to a lot of folks is, if you don't have this conversation with your kids, somebody else will. And right now, most of our kids are being educated through social media and entertainment or entertainers. And that is great to a point, but we need to also, bring back science into the conversation, bring back history, bring back reality. So what does this mean to their day-to-day lives? I don't think it's, in today's world, if you're a parent, it's probably not wise to believe that your teenage or your kids 10 plus don't have access to this information online or through their friends or through their peer groups. And so I think it's important that parents interrupt as they start to get some of this information and supply an alternative view that is not just do not use drugs or do not have sex or do not whatever, but it's more nuanced, and it does take into consideration that we live in a world where just saying do not do is not enough. Kids want answers. I know when I was younger, I wanted answers. And if I didn't get the answer, then I was looking to somebody else to give me. And unfortunately, when I think back of being a young child and 13 years old and trying to find out more about cannabis, just based on that curiosity of finding wild hemp on an army base, the folks that ended up teaching me about cannabis didn't have my best interest at heart. They're the type of folks that were preying on this, naive mind that was curious but had no direction. And so I think there's a great opportunity to stop that in its tracks and prevent people that will prey on kids, people that will prey on ignorance, prevent those folks from even being able to get a grasp, on the youth of today.
Absolutely. And I hope, Brian, that we may actually have a chance to get involved and start talking to parent groups, parent-teacher groups, because the time to talk to your children is probably when they're between, would you say, I like that 11 to 14 with 12 being the sweet spot. Would you agree with that?
Well, it depends. So, the book, when we went through Amazon, they vetted the book and we said, it's 9 to 17-year-olds based on the language, the subject matter. And, that's the right age where, kids, they're very interested in wondering what their parents do for a living and can truly understand it. But there've been mothers and fathers that have purchased the book and their 6-year-olds are fully engaged in the book. There's one 6-year-old who noticed that, we didn't have a particular item in our book, a particular sector. And she was looking for where her mother worked and she was, Mom, where is packaging, right? And so mother emailed me back and I told the mother, I said, let the 6-year-old know we're gonna add packaging into our glossary under manufacturing, which it sits, but we didn't explicitly say it in our first edition book. So, that's an example of a 6-year-old who knows what mom does for a living, was going through this book with their mother, and immediately was like, where's mom's job, right? And so, I think the age group is probably a bit wider. Ultimately, it's a guide for parents. So we're hoping that parents will take this and they'll be able to get a better understanding of who it's a good fit for. I'll tell you one last story. There's a father, cannabis entrepreneur, and he was sharing it with his son. His son is 3-4 years old, and too young to truly understand the subject matter, but he loved the characters. And so he was going through the book, and the little boy Neil is like, where's Charlotte? Where's Charlotte? And so it really is, I think, a book that could be shared with the whole family at all ages, really. But ideally, that's the guidance is really going to be the parents.
And I will admit, I read it cover to cover.
Nice.
Okay, today, 37 pages.
Jimmy, did you understand all the words?
Yes, I did.
We had a glossary at the
Thank
back.
God for that glossary, right? Thank God for that glossary. So, Brian, it's 4:20, and as you know, 4:20 is a magical time in the cannabis space. It's usually when we take our break and we explain how it all started with the Waldos in San Rafael, California, and then the Grateful Dead got involved. This is also going to allow me to plug an interview that I did, I think it was yesterday. Every day is long these days, with Trixie Garcia, who is the daughter of Jerry Garcia, the longtime great guitar player for the Grateful Dead. And it was a great interview. We're going to release it next week. It's you'll see a little piece of it in the We Talk News program that follows this live show. We are talking about the international market of cannabis. And because we actually only have 2 guests in the next half hour planned, if you want to stay until 5 o'clock and join Nathan and Chris, and we'll explain who they are after the break, you are more than welcome to do that.
Absolutely. I'd love to.
All right. So in the meantime, it is 4:20. It's time. This is the time when we play Shanty by Jonathan Edwards, which is my version of 420. It was the song that we identified with when we were children, a folk rocker from New Hampshire. And this is his rendition of Shanty from a public radio studio. And David's putting on his jester hat. He doesn't understand chroma key and how it works because it's blue and green. It's going to blend into the background. But we'll explain that to him after this break. We'll be back.